Okay, so throughout the last couple of years, we've been covering the Gaza-Israel genocide. And because the military didn't win in the negotiation, and they didn't manage to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and chuck them into Jordan and Egypt and into the Sinai, Jordan and Egypt signed a new alliance with the GCC, essentially. The GCC had normalization through China with Iran, and Iran stopped back in the Axis. And Qatar, which was the funder, look, Iran is the boogie monster. They say that they're funding all the Axis. Qatar was doing that, but Qatar is a US ally with a US base. And then I talked about how we had the 12th date. We had October the 7th, which was nothing like it was covered. But that was essentially a false flag operation. It did happen, but it was to set the conflict. Then we entered into the 12-day war, which was a theater to give everyone their narrative. And then finally, we entered into the Doha, where Israel struck on Qatar. And I said that would reset the game and be the catalyst for the next stage. You can go back to any of my old blogs. I created a blog on that. I think it was on the 12th of September when I was covering it live. And that did actually mark the change. So now we're at the ceasefire. I said Israel doesn't rule the world, but they'll manage the divorce between US and Israel. You had people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen, now even Nick Fuentes is going on these shows in order to make Americans hate Jews because of what happened, because they're saying you control the world. And so therefore we need to free ourselves. And America gets to have the plausible deniability from the genocide. And then essentially the Gulf countries get to acquire all of the assets in Israel. And then Gaza gets to be rebuilt and the Levant gets restructured with a US exit under the control of the Gulf Cooperation Council, who has normalized with Iran via their BRICS partnership. So what are the next steps that we're expecting in the Gaza conflict? So the ceasefire, obviously there has been few little hiccups there, here and there, but I'm not expecting this to turn to the Greater Israel Project. The Greater Israel Project, aka the Greater American Military Industrial Complex Project, is essentially over, but we've got to have this managed transition to regional stability. So there'll be hiccups along the way, but once you get the independent Arab security within Palestine, that's it. We have entered a new era. Once that happens, which is the final, next step that we're trying to get to, it will probably be Egypt and Jordan and Turkey that have their military ready, and some GCC factions. Once they are there, instead of Israeli occupation, the occupation is over, the genocide is over, which was propping up the dollar by stopping the Middle East unify around their resources and work with China and BRICS. We enter into that new world order. This is an event the size of the fall of the Berlin Wall in terms of impact. This really marks the end of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order and the managed decline of the dollar that we covered in part 2. So once you have the security in, you'll get regime change within Hamas because Hamas is no longer needed because it will actually be an independent Palestine under the Palestinian Authority, most likely with a GCC puppet government, not an Israeli or US puppet. I'm expecting regime change within Israel as well, where you'll get the Smotrich and the Gavirs. They're looking like they're going to go crazy. They're not going to listen to America and all that stuff. But eventually it will lead to a destabilization campaign and the change of Israel to, rather than working for the US military industrial complex, working for regional stability with the Gulf countries. They will privatize all of the nationalized assets. More of them will go bankrupt and they will be acquired by Gulf countries. And they'll be able to have a financial rails, energy rails, trade routes that will be unified across the region, and will enter into this regional stability era that really has never been able to happen since the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the installation of Sykes-Picot by the French and British Empire. And so the Levant will be essentially economically vassalized. Again, I'm not saying what I want to happen. I'm not saying what is just. I'm saying that by following the money, this is what I think is going to happen, and the deal will hold. There'll be hiccups along the way. There'll be, any militias. They'll be integrated or eliminated, but nothing stops this train in terms of the region being unified around regional stability as well. Okay. I said there was actually an interesting announcement from one of the major Israeli steel firms. They went into bankruptcy after Turkey basically sanctioned the company. That cost massive financial, and you'd expect a bailout probably from UAE, which is playing good cop, and Saudi, which is playing bad cop, and Qatar, which is really US allied. And they're playing, and also working with BRICS as well. So what does this actually do? This essentially, after we get these bailouts, I think slowly over time, you get a two-state solution that moves to something that looks more like a one-state solution that eventually looks like Arab majority. And you just have what Palestine was, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews all lived in peace together. It was Arab majority. Before the colonial expeditions and the military-industrial complex recruited a useful idiot army called the IDF in order to destabilize the region. And so that really, really does make a difference. And so I'd expect more acquisitions and announcements to follow as Israel's debt to GDP goes up. And then, basically, if the Gulf sovereign wealth says, right, I'm not going to invest in that AI deal, but I'm going to invest in China's AI, or I'm going to reduce the petrodollar slightly and increase the yuan dollar slightly, they get all the leverage in order to negotiate those relationships. And they sit between BRICS and the regional empire of America, which would just be regional control. As I said, it will control Canada, Mexico, Latin America, Central America, Europe, those different, its neighbors essentially. And so anyone that is a neighbor of the proof of weapons network, sorry, it's not going to be good. Anybody that is an exiting neighbor of the US military, it's going to be good. And China's going to be investing. GCC's going to be investing. There will definitely be predatory deals, but by nature, it's not regime change because that's not the goal. The goal is not to change how they govern in order to have neoliberalism. And then with neoliberalism, you get financialization and securitization, which then leads to control, currency warfare, IMF debt, and dollar dependency. That model is over. And watch part 2 if you want to see how that happens. And essentially, the proof of weapons network is leveraging and now needs to escalate media to give itself more attention because there is a new negotiation. The new negotiation is that once you get the Gulf countries, Jordan, Egypt, in Palestine, the deal is the deal. And so before you get there, let's take attention away from what Israel is doing. It gets to weaken them as a pariah state, but also put attention on what UAE is doing. So enter Sudan. If you hadn't noticed, there's been a big uptick in the media of covering what's happening in Sudan. And what is happening in Sudan is a humanitarian crisis. But it made it to the United Nations. There was protests outside UK, and there was coverage on Qatar-sponsored media like Al Jazeera. And that made it to Western media. Now, Western media, plus Al Jazeera, plus United Nations, plus protests in the UK and across Europe, that means that this is an operation to bring attention to what's happening in Sudan. Not because it's a humanitarian crisis, but because of the political leverage, which implies to me, just like in Gaza, that we're about to reset that order. Because with the Gulf countries, they're going to need to they're going to need to manage their relationship, because where does China get all their rare earth? They get it from Africa and various other Asian countries, and of course the resources of the Middle East. And so they're, in effect, BRICS is handing over, through this partnership with the GCC, effective control of the negotiations with the Western Hemisphere and the Proof of Weapons Network. And in the Proof of Weapons Network, looking to gain leverage, it needs to ruin UAE's reputation. So media brings attention, but doesn't give the full details. So what is happening in Sudan? Now, there is a big history, but in order to follow the money, you just need to understand the flows that are happening in the current version of what's happening. Because the past was always based upon regional dominance by the West, which would extract for 800 years all of Africa's resources in order to get those vital components for the technical industrial complex, Apple, electric vehicles, batteries, all of the things that were needed. But in 2019, there was a coup, which was backed by UAE, of a organization called RSF. Now, the difference between RSF and then the other side of that is SAF, which is the existing Sudanese power structure. The coup was attempted, backed by the UAE, but it was an internal struggle. And so that internal struggle already existed. So it wasn't like the West, where they fund ISIS and Al-Qaeda and then get them to destabilize a country so that they can steal the resources and then create religious tensions and say, hey, we now need to put strikes in Somalia, for example, because we're pretending we're coming after ISIS, which was funded by the West. This one was actually a genuine internal struggle. So you had an attempted coup in 2019, and that was essentially the RSF. Now, it's not an external militia, it's internal, but it is supported by... And this makes UAE look incredibly bad because they want to control the resources between China and the West so that the West can exit. Remember, the West is negotiating their exit. And so they would have extended that to rare earth minerals, China, and the power struggle between the GCC sitting in the middle between this multipolar world. And so if you can draw lots of media attention to the crimes against humanity that are happening in Sudan, then you get negotiation leverage using the United Nations. Now, what is the other side? The SAF, who are they backed by? Well, they got support from Saudi Arabia and Egypt. So within the GCC, you can be on the other side of a power struggle, but still unified around regional stability. And my prediction is there's probably going to be, like the Gaza conflict, a year, 2 years, I don't know, however long it's going to be, but we're going to move towards probably, segregation, a separatist movement. And I doubt maybe, RSF, there should be trialed for their crimes against humanity. Whether it happens or not is another thing. But essentially, you got Egypt backing the SAF, the Sudanese government, and then you've got a separatist movement, militia, which is committing crimes against humanity, the RSF, which is backed by UAE. I'm expecting this to come to an end eventually as part of this managed negotiation. And so why is this attention happening right now? Remember, UAE gaining power is not in the interest in the negotiation of the Proof of Weapons Network. The Proof of Weapons Network owns the US, so it doesn't care about America, but it does care about access to resources so that it can control the routes when it wants to launch its currency wars, just like the banks are doing it with Bitcoin, the central banks are doing it with gold. The other side is the resources, and the Saudis and Qatar and the GCC have got the petrodollar and the yuan dollar. The rare earth minerals for semiconductor chips and batteries are the resources that are important in the negotiation between the Proof of Weapons Network and China. Remember, Trump is negotiating for corporate interests, not for America, and China is negotiating for its country's interest because it's got a system where the money is recycled into its own people rather than for corporate interest through the debt-based Ponzi scheme because the Fed is owned by the banks. So this is an alternative to UAE legacy model or the US model. So if UAE does not do this, US would be doing this. And it looks like US are testing this structure as part of the GCC negotiations of handing over to UAE and GCC. And so I'm looking for what comes next and what types of deals, and I'll continue to follow the money. But it gives the proof of weapons network via US, via United Nations, the ability to gain some moral credibility by blame shifting over to the crimes against humanity that UAE is committing versus what's happening with Israel in the Gaza side. So the US is okay with any outcome at this stage because the US is not acting in America's interest. It's acting in the proof of weapons network, which is the CEO of BlackRock, which wants a multipolar world order. So that power structure through the lobby comes down. But we got a massive increase in the narrative of basically it was saying the UAE is committing genocide in order to steal gold. That's kind of the narrative that's being perpetuated. And so because the UAE supported the coup in 2019 and probably supports factions, but we don't know to what extent, remember that this is supported by a global power structure. This is a US, France, Europe exit at the same time as Russian imperialism, at the same time as China and their rare earth minerals Belt and Road Initiative empire. So if you look at what's really happening, you had UAE that backed the coup. You had China that has been arming the RSF through the China weapons. And you've had Chad, which used to be aligned with America and is now aligned with Russia, that has been sending their militias and mercenaries in order to give RSF the power that they have been taking. Now, these militias and mercenaries have been committing horrible crimes against humanity. And obviously, if you can blame it all on UAE, that ties into the negotiations right now. Why? Because what is the UAE traditional structure? Well, for decades, or not for decades, for a long time, gold has already been sold to Kenya. And so the gold is not utilized for Sudan. All resources are stolen, and that has propped up the Kenya side, which is why we're seeing some of the regime changes and colored revolutions within Kenya at the moment. All of these relationships I expect over the years ahead in Africa to be resolved, to work with the GCC and to be funded by BRICS China Belt and Road Initiative as we get these US exits, which is the important of the trade negotiations, rare earth minerals, of everything we're seeing right now as America becomes a regional power. And so the gold that has been stolen from Sudan has actually been sold in the souks, in the markets in Dubai. Now, that is actually by Sudanese people quite often. And so it's going direct from gold being extracted, sold in the Dubai markets to the souks, but there's no evidence that it's going on to the sovereign wealth fund of Dubai itself. So this structure for selling gold and the Kenyan structure has gone on for a while. But obviously you can change the narrative and you can say UAE is committing a genocide in order to steal the gold so that the sovereign wealth can build up their supplies at the moment. Now, I'm not absolving UAE because I think they should personally completely back out of this. I think it's making them looking incredibly bad. But obviously, they've had negotiations based upon their US exit in the region. So there are things behind the scenes that we can't possibly know. Obviously, the nuance is not coming out. And so the narrative of the proof of weapons network says, let's focus on Sudan right now to increase the leverage as well. So the GCC wants to be between BRICS and US. That is happening. The proof of weapons network gets to leverage the US and the Middle East in order to give more power to the corporate interest. but they are engineering the rise of the Middle East and the rise of Africa, because Africa still has the highest birth rates in the world, while they put America in the East on artificial intelligence and robotics, and they negotiate their partnerships with the sovereign wealth funds to co-invest through the financial industrial complex. All of this to say is that hopefully we're going to witness the end of the Gaza conflict soon. There are still crimes against humanity still being committed. And the trigger we need is when we see that Jordanian, Egyptian, Turkish, and GCC forces will never go back. There'll be regime change, as I covered in the beginning. And then we'll get the resolution between the African countries, the GCC, BRICS, rare earth minerals. Everything falls into place. So this is why Trump has essentially been the best thing to the financial industrial complex of the proof of weapons network, because April the 2nd was, through tariff policy, about liberating the world from the dollar. And that means you need to adjust. You need to understand what's happening. And you can get some additional leverage by destroying reputations through the media networks that we're seeing right now. But it doesn't change what is coming to the West. You know, military, if it is exiting Middle East, it needs to make up for lost profits at home and in the Latin American, European region. And so that's why you're seeing everything that you're seeing with the civil unrest campaigns. So with that in mind, we have covered part 1 this week in Bitcoin, part 2 this week in macro, part 3 this week in geopolitics. And now we're going to go to the final section, part 4, enjoy yourself, where we're going to do a live air of an interview that I gave last week or the week before. I can't remember. I think it was the week before. Time is flying. And it was an interview with Danny from Capital Cosm, a YouTube channel. I'll just go through what we covered in the interview. So if you haven't watched it already, then you can enjoy it. And then we're going to end up, and that's going to do everything for Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 104. What is the real meaning between the US-China trade deal? And we covered this week in Bitcoin macro and geopolitics. Okay, so part 4. In the interview, I covered how in the next 5 years, I'm predicting 200 years of change that everybody needs to prepare them for. For those of you that are not familiar with the intricacies of the proof of weapons network, how it relates to the financial, technical, military, consumer, debt-based Ponzi scheme, Danny asked some questions, so I went deeper into that. I then covered also, some more details about the controlled demolition of the dollar in the United States and the currency war. We went through the manufactured wars and how they actually profit from it. We did updates on the Ukraine, Venezuela, and Gaza situation, made some predictions that later came true as well. And we go through deeper into BRICS and GCC and how they're utilizing de-dollarization in partnership with the financial industrial complex. I went through the real Trump agenda, where this ends, where this goes next. And I went deeper into the K-shaped economy, where the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and how that actually works and how to protect yourself with assets. Deeper into the surveillance state, what to expect, how the rollout's happening, Palantir, digital ID in the UK, artificial intelligence. And I left everyone with where I'm going to leave you at the end of this interview, which is how to put together an escape plan. I hate to tell you the things that are happening without giving you a plan. Remember, the fall of one side is the rise of another side. I want you to always stay on the right side of this change. Always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do well. I want you to stay on the right side of the change. So we'll move over to the interview. I'm just going to put it on the screen. I want you to make this transition with peace, love, and unity. And that's going to do it for me for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 104. But enjoy the interview. We're going to play it right now. And I'll be seeing you next week for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 105. So let's see if I